Осторожно, двери закрываются. Следующая станция из метро.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Igor Kovalev. I'm the Chief Specialist at the Career Orientation Center of Moscow Metropolitan, and this is the second lecture in English in our account about the Moscow Underground. In today's air, we will take a look on the evolution of trains that help people move around Moscow since 1935 and see how the technological progress changes the way we live. Let's start with the very beginning. The dawn of Moscow's underground. The Metropolitan of Moscow became the first underground railway in the Soviet Union. The first plans to build the subway in Moscow appeared in the late 19th century, but for various reasons, the idea was postponed and postponed and postponed. Various projects were rejected until one day, May 15, 1935, the first subway line comprising 10 stations from Sokolniki to Gorky Park opened its doors to the first passengers. This year, the Metropolitan of Moscow celebrates its 85th anniversary, and it is currently the 6th busiest underground railway in the world by annual passenger traffic, which is around 2.5 billion passengers every year. And the underground of today provides us with the most modern and technologically advanced trains equipped with Wi-Fi, air conditioning, touchscreen displays and other joys of life given to us by the world technological progress. But it was not always so. At the dawn of the Moscow Underground, there were trains that looked completely different. Today, I invite you to take a look on how the idea of subway cars has changed over the last 85 years of the Moscow Metro history. So let's start. The very first trains of Moscow Metro, the Type A cars. The bodies and bogies for the first cars that provided the first years of work of the Moscow subway were commissioned to be built by the Carriage Works located in Mytishi, which is a small town near Moscow. All the technical works, as well as installation of the equipment on the electric cars, were performed there. The first two-car section that consisted of one motor car, which was apparently number 1, and one trailer car, which was number 1001, was manufactured at the end of 1934. As I mentioned before, the first cars received the name Type A, although the name itself couldn't be found anywhere but in the technical documentation and literature, as no letters were put on the bodies of these trains, only numbers. Of course, the design of the subway cars was based on the railroad electric trains of that time, but to simplify the works, especially during the construction of tunnels, the overall dimensions of electric cars for the subway were reduced in comparison with the size of railway cars and had a maximum width of 2.7 meters. Width of passenger cars of mainline railways at that time was 3.1 meter. Also, the length of Type A cars was 19 meters. The car itself had an all-welded body. All body frame elements were made of carbon steel sheets. The weight of the motor car was 52 tons, while the weight of the trailer was 36 tons. Here, I guess I need to explain for people who are not very familiar, not too keen on the topic of the underground and trains, the difference between a motor car and a trailer car. So a motor car is actually a car that has a motor, and also, of course, not also, sometimes it has a driver's seat. It's a car that can drive by itself. And then there is a trailer car, which does not have a motor, which can't go by itself. It just sticks to the motor car and drives with it. So then we have two types of motor cars. We have a motor car with a driver's seat, which is usually the first and the last cars or wagons actually. So car is also wagon, but for me it's more comfortable to say car than wagon, so just keep that in mind. A car is a wagon. And then we have a motor car which does not have a driver's seat, which is apparently 99% of cars that we have in the Moscow Underground these days, like in 2020. So, Each motor and trailer car had 52 seats and 120 standing places, though the maximum capacity of these type of cars was 262 people. Bear that thing in mind. 262. You will compare a bit later. The cars were equipped with 4 double-leaf doors on each side, which were closed and opened by the driver simultaneously throughout the train by means of electro-pneumatic actuators and door air diffusers, unlike, by the way, in some other countries, where they were closed by the driver and opened only manually by passengers at that time. Maximum speed of Type A trains was 60-65 kilometers per hour. These cars were mostly two-color, brown and sandy yellow or brown beige, and inside there were soft seats on spring base. But here on the picture you can see a yellow and green modification of the Type A train. It just was recolored for the exposition. It should also be noted that in the first cars of the Moscow subway there was no alarm system that would warn people that the doors were closing. What I mean to say is that when the doors are closing nowadays, you hear a sound. Attention, doors are closing, or in Russian, осторожно, двери закрываются. But at that time, there was no sound like that. The doors were simply closing, and of course, that was not too comfortable for the passengers of that time. The lighting in the first trains was made in the form of sconces with open lamps, as you can see in here. But for some reason, rather soon after the start of exploiting, bulbs in here began to disappear, and therefore the original lighting did not last long and it was replaced by closed lamps. By the way, a characteristic feature of subway cars in many countries at that time was the presence of an end door in front of the driver's cabin, as you will see in the video that I'm showing you at the moment just a little bit later. The first Type A cars, as I already mentioned, left the assembly line in 1934 and went into operation on May 15, 1935, the day of the opening of the first line of the Moscow subway. Moreover, the very first subway trains consisted of only 2 cars, so one motor car, one, by the way, you can see the door in here near the driver's seat. So, only 2 cars, so one motor car and one trailer car. Then, a few years later, 4-car and 6-car trains appeared. Type A cars were produced for 3 years until approximately 1937, with varying success, having passed several technical modifications. Over the years, Type A trains met passengers at Moscow subway stations until approximately 1975, when the last trains of this series were decommissioned, which means it served Moscow citizens for more than 40 years overall. After the decommissioning, one of the cars, the very first trailer car, which is number 1001, as I mentioned before, was converted into a travel meter and sent to Baku Metro, which was Azerbaijani Soviet Republic at that time. Now it's actually the country of Azerbaijan. Then 2 more cars served as a flow detector and development laboratory in the metro of Moscow until approximately 1999. The very first car, car number 1, with the original interior, including open lamps, was transferred for storage in the depot Izmailova, where it is still located. By the way, we offer excursions to this depot, so if you take an excursion to that place, you may see the very first wagon, very first car of the Moscow subway. By the way, in 2015 and 2016, Type A cars were presented at the exhibitions of retro trains in Moscow, and then a train even made a short trip in the underground, carrying passengers down the Arbatsko-Pokrovskaya line as part of the excursion into the past event. Then, Series B cars, actually a modernized A series. In 1936, even before the opening of the third Gorkovskaya metro line, a section from Ploshchad Sverlova station to Sokol station. The Moscow Metro Department began to draw up the task of designing motor cars of a more advanced design than Type A. The new motor cars were to be launched with the opening of the new Gorkovskaya line, and therefore were named as Type G, after the name of the line, Gorkovskaya line, Type G. However, by 1937, the design and manufacture of the new type of electric cars was not yet complete, by far not complete, while the line itself was almost ready to open. And therefore, the management of Moscow Metro decided to start with a few improvements to Type A cars and launch them on the new line on the day of its opening. So, keep that in mind also. There should have been a Type G car, but there was no Type G car because they were not ready for the opening of the Gorkovskaya line. That's why they had to create something else just to show something new to the passengers during the opening of the new line. Initially, it was planned that the cars would receive only a minor upgrade, and the updated model would still refer to the Type A, but with an additional index, say A1 or AS if you wish, by analogy with the naming of today's smartphones, 6, 6S, 7, 7S, 10, 10S, 10S Max, etc. But in the course of the project drafting, the management concluded that the changes are too significant to call it a simple modification. So it was decided to call the new model the B-type car. As for the improvements, there were several mostly technical changes. The current collectors were replaced by more advanced ones. Then the brake system and electrical equipment were improved. In addition, the ventilation system in the sections has been changed. Instead of traditional ventilated windows, special intakes pointed in one direction were introduced. Another important thing is, these cars were the first to be equipped with an alarm system, a true alarm system to warn passengers about the closing of doors, and a lighting system in case of accident. So, as I mentioned before, the Type A did not have this sign "Осторожно, двери закрываются" or "Attention, doors are closing", and the Type B they already had. For passengers, that actually was the most important improvement of these cars, because from the exterior there were not too many changes in the design of this car. Then Series B was produced by the same Metisha Car Works from 1937 to 1939. This type of cars was in action for almost 40 years, as it was sent to rest only in 1976. Now, let's continue. What do we have next? I already gave you a small spoiler of the next series of cars. I told you that there was the Series G car. But as I said earlier, initially there were no B-type cars planned. The G-type cars were planned to be prepared for the launch of the third subway line, the Gorkovskaya, which is now Zamoskvoretskaya, by the way, opened in 1938. But difficulties in producing a new model, which meant to be fundamentally different from the previous one, caused a certain delay, and as a result, the first prototypes of the new model were created only in 1939. By the way, here it is on the picture. That's exactly the very first G-type train. As you can see, it differs a bit from the A and B types, because here it has a special lighting indicating the terminal station. Then overally it looks a bit more soft in the design than the first and the second types of trains. They actually differed significantly from their predecessors by the elegant appearance and efficiency of driving. In addition, there were the first carriages painted blue, which later became a distinctive feature of the Moscow Metro. The construction of these new cars was going at a rapid pace, but the sudden outbreak of World War II stalled the work in this direction, resulting in the return to full production only in 1946 to 1947. Taking that into account, the G-type car was put into full operation only in 1948. An important feature is that all the Series G cars were motorized from the start. Remember I told you the difference between a motorized and a trailer car, as it was decided to abandon the trailer cars at all. This change allowed to increase the maximum speed from 60 to 75 km per hour. Another feature of G-type cars was lighter weight, softer running and smoother braking due to use of electric rheostatic brakes. Through whole production period, 1938 to 1940 and then 1946 to 1955, Medici Carriage Works produced 420 cars overall, the last of which were used in the Moscow Metropolitan and also in St. Petersburg subway up to 1983. Now, let's head to the next type of cars, which is called Series V carriages. For those of you who are a bit familiar with the Cyrillic alphabets of the Russian language, it is no secret that the order of letters in it is quite different from the one that we have in the Latin alphabet, because in the Latin alphabet it goes A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and in the Russian, the Cyrillic alphabet, it goes A, B, V, G, D, E, Z. So, what I mean to say is that for the 40s of the previous century, there were three models operating in the Moscow underground, which for some reason were named A and B and then G. So you can see some correspondence with the Russian alphabet, because we have A, B, G. So the only letter that lacks here is V. You would ask, where is the V type? Well, here it is. And the point here is that I'm telling you about these models of trains in chronological order of their commissioning, and for all types of cars such chronology will be comparable to the chronology of their actual development and production in Soviet Union, except for V-type cars. The reason is the V-type cars were not produced in the Soviet Union at all. These are actually the cars manufactured in Germany in 1927 to 1930. Which were brought to Moscow from East Berlin in 1945, after the war, in the amount of approximately 120 cars. You can see that their appearance differs a bit from the ones that we had at our times. The lighting is smaller, the whole car is actually a bit smaller, then you have smaller windows in here, the color is different, then you have special signs in here. So, these cars brought from Germany were modernized and adjusted to the standards of the Moscow Metropolitan, of course, as far as possible. Because the German cars themselves were initially made for use in the Berlin underground, so they were a bit smaller than the Moscow subway. And finally, in 1946, they were launched to operate successfully until 1964. Thus, the V-type car was produced earlier than all other models of the Moscow subway. It was produced earlier than the A and B types, which are meant to be the ancestors of the V, but no. And also, the V-type car was decommissioned earlier. Whilst in terms of chronology, it became only the fourth car to start circulating the lines of the capital's underground, which is a rather funny story to my mind. The last body of the German car still remains in the Krasnaya Presnya depot, and I personally am hoping that one day it will be restored. Now, let's head for the next type. The next is Series D cars. The pre-production model of the series cars was produced in 1949 under the designation M5, like Metro 5. After a certain improvement, the serial production of this type of cars, named D already, started at 1955. The new cars appeared in the Metro at 1956 and were operating there until 1995. So, also for almost 40 years. We can see that the cars of that time were pretty good, pretty nice quality, because they actually worked for more than 40 years, each of them. That is a perfect result. Visually, they did not differ much from the previous G-series car. The number of seats was reduced a bit though, which allowed to create special rooms near the doors for standing passengers, as we have now at the Moscow Metropolitan with all the metros, with all the cars. So here you can see that there is some space between the door frame and the beginning of the seat. In the previous models there was no space in here, so when people entered the car, they could actually stop in here, so they had no space to stand near the door. They could actually only sit or stand in here. But now, with the introduction of the D-type cars, they could stand near the doors, which helped keep more people inside of the car. At the same time, the weight of these series cars was decreased by 7 tons compared to the Gs, down to 36 tons, due to which the power consumption was reduced and the maximum speed was also increased to 70 kilometers per hour. There were also some differences in running gear, electrical and mechanical equipment, and these series cars were produced until 1963, where 662 cars were produced in total. Despite a special drawback, which was noticeable transverse rolling over, these cars were also successfully operated in Kiev, Leningrad and Novosibirsk Metropolitan. It is noteworthy that in the compartments of these exact type of trains, the lights went out during the passage to the depot, as well as at the exit from the tunnel to the open sections of the lines. Then, project number 6, the series cars. The experimental trains of series were produced in 1959 to 1960, and there were only 7 of them. Then the serial production was carried out from 1963 to 1968. By the way, it was possible to have a ride in the car of this series up to 2008, so up until rather recently. The cars got corrugated metal strips on the body, so the cladding became stronger and aerodynamics improved. You can see here these metal strips. So this is the type of cars that received the famous strips that also became a special feature of the Moscow Metropolitan. For the first time in the history of Moscow Metro cars, the door openings were expanded, which allowed to speed up boarding and landing of the passengers. You can see in here, the doors here are a bit wider. So, of course, you can't compare because I don't have a picture of the previous models with you, but just believe me that these doors are a bit wider than the previous ones. Because of this introduction, the car itself lost its symmetry. The door openings shifted relative to the center of the body. Then, for the first time in the Moscow Underground, aluminium alloys were used in the design of the doors and some other body elements. In addition, series were the first to have the link crush, the material used in the interiors replaced with plastic. The cars were even lighter than the D series, 31.7 tons, so more than 4 tons less than the previous model, and the actual maximum speed was already about 80 kilometers per hour. In addition to the Moscow subway, series cars went to Leningrad, Kiev, Tbilisi and Baku, so these cars were used in 5 different metropolitans all around the globe. An interesting fact, it was originally planned that the next car model would be given the G-series name. For this reason, the modernized model of the series, which was designed as a transition to G, was called Yozh, which can literally be translated from Russian as Hedgehog. This type of cars became very popular with the citizens of Moscow, with the passengers of Moscow Underground. By the way, you can see it in here. This is a famous picture called Ежик в тумане, which was called like that, Hedgehog in the Fog. Carriages of this type were made up until 1973, but in the underground of the capital it is possible to see them even in 2020. Can you imagine? So this is probably the longest lasting car there is in the underground of Moscow nowadays. Now, let's head for the next project. It's project number 7, the 81-714 and 81-717 series cars, or so-called number cars. The gradually outdated E-type cars, which I mentioned earlier, had to be modernized. In the mid-70s, brand new cars were created that differed significantly from their predecessors, which, as it was decided after all, did not receive their name after a letter, but received the number 87-717 and 14. The series turned out to be very successful and naturally became the most widespread in the history not only of the Moscow metro, but of all subways in the world. Can you imagine? In total, more than 7,280 copies were produced for today, and the production still goes on. These cars can be seen in 18 subways around the globe. Compared to Yor, the load limit of the number cars was significantly increased from 2,062 to 330 passengers. You can imagine it's a huge number compared to the amount of trains used in the Moscow Underground. The maximum speed was also significantly increased, up to 90 kilometers per hour. One of the peculiarities of this series is that the first time there was a possibility of direct communication with the driver from inside of each car introduced. The driver's seat and the train control panel were moved from the right side of the cabin to the center in front of a large windshield. Also, pay attention, the end door, which I mentioned earlier, was removed only in this very model. So all the previous models had this end door near the driver's seat, which was not used for quite a long time, but as these trains were made from the Type A series, on the base of the Type A series, they all had this door, and this is the first model that got this door excluded from the design. Externally, the cars are pretty similar to their ancestors Yor, but with coarser and angular external bypasses and flat forehead, in the lower part of which there is a row of 6 or 8 headlights, which is also a new thing. The interior decoration of all trains is different because the cars were repeatedly repaired and modernized. So here you can see one of the old decorations. Of course, there are some new. They look pretty much alike, but more modern, with some more modern features. Because, as I mentioned earlier, these cars are produced even these days. Now, the number cars received many modifications, including those for use in subways of other cities and countries, including apparently most of the CIS countries, because back in the Soviet Union they were all designed almost the same, but also such countries as Hungary, Czech Republic, and even Poland. Can you imagine? You can see these trains. I'm currently talking to my Russian viewers who understand English. You can see these trains in Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary. And some of these modifications are still produced in 2020. Can you imagine? This is just fantastic. Now, let's head for the project number 8, which actually comprises more than one series. I'd call it Searching for the Perfect Car. It comprises an unrealized project Type E car and an experimental car called Yauza. The success, stability and failure-free number car, which I mentioned earlier, allowed the engineers to devote more of their time to the development of a conceptually new project, which would not be a direct heir to the previous model, like all alphabetic cars and the resulting number car, but would be something completely new. An ideal car for Moscow Metro, with a futuristic design and the most advanced technologies. To this end, since the late 70s, engineers have created more than one experimental model of cars, including the famous experimental car Type E, which could develop a speed of up to 100 kilometers per hour and could accommodate 30 to 40 people more than the number car. The E-Type was followed first by an experimental and then by an operational version of the Yauza model car, which actually became the first in the Moscow subway to receive a special name, Yauza. So it was not alphabetical, was not a number. It was a complete name used specially to indicate this train. The pilot version of Yauza was released from the assembly line in 1998 in a very limited number. More exactly, only 7 trains. Then it received a modification, also in a very small number, about 20 to 30 trains. The last, cars of which were peacefully rolling passengers on the streets of Moscow up until the second half of 2019. So actually until very recently, so they were decommissioned only half a year ago. So these were experiments, and these experiments led the engineers to the creation of a car that they are very proud of these days, which is, I'm gonna show it to you now, which is the project number 9, Rusich type cars. As I said, the E-type car, followed by Yauza, became an excellent springboard for testing new technologies in the field of transport. Thanks to these experiments, year 2002 saw the beginning of production of the next series of trains, which were named Rusich. Cars of this series differed radically from numbered cars, both externally and in technical equipment. But of course, they had more than 30 years of technological progress in their advantage. Then, Rusich looks much more futuristic than his predecessors and develops a speed of up to 110 kilometers per hour, while being much more maneuverable due to the fact that the cars themselves are made in sections. You can see it in here, so the trains, all the cars are made in two sections. In other words, each Rusich car consists of 2 parts which are connected with each other. And initially the cars were named Skiff, but soon after the run-in, the series were renamed into Rusich, because that was what the passengers wanted to name this car. Among the numerous novelties of the trains were virtual information boards, you can see it in here, special heating and air conditioning system in here, double glazed windows with reduced noise level, and also, for the first time in the Moscow Underground, Wi-Fi routers. In subsequent modifications, of course, not in 2002, because there was no Wi-Fi in the underground at that time, but a bit later, in 2004, 2005, they were introduced. Among the numerous novelties of the trains, as I said, there was virtual information boards, yes, and one car could carry up to 370 passengers, which, bear in mind, I told you to remember the quantity of passengers which can fit in the first Type A wagon, which was 260. Now Rusich could carry more than 100 passengers more, and this is while the actual size of the car is not too different. In Rusich, particular attention was paid to safety, as the car is equipped with safety devices preventing passengers from falling on rails between the cars. Also, the design of cabin doors does not allow spontaneous opening, and thanks to the locking system, the train cannot move before all the doors are firmly closed. Now, 10. OK type trains. The OK series trains became direct heir to Rusich. They were produced from 2010 to 2016. The first operational model was presented during the opening of the Marina Russia station of Moscow Metro on June 19, 2010. But the year of the actual start of operating of the OK trains is 2012. Nowadays, there are around 1,300 such cars in the capital. A distinctive feature of some of these trains is the stylized numbers 75 on the head cars of some of them, because it is in the Jubilee year that they were presented. One of the main purposes of creation of OK was an attempt to make the construction cheaper, as the cost of Yauza and Rusich, which is saw earlier, was noted as too high. From the Rusich, OK inherited smooth vertical body sidewalls, an inclined profile of a face part, microprocessor control system, and some other stuff. However, many structural elements have undergone changes. But certainly, OK has received all the most modern technologies that have been presented in the Rusich, and even some more, such as air conditioners, mentioned before, places for people with disabilities, and children prams. These cars also have Wi-Fi system introduced from the very first day. The walls, ceiling and floor are aligned with easy-to-wash materials that meet the requirements of fire safety and sanitary standards. For the first time in the history of Moscow Metro, there was a train that had an open passage through all the cars. Now, let's head for project number 11, the most recent project in the Moscow Metro. These are the famous, most modern, magnificent trains Moskva, which were launched in 2017. In spite of the fact that Moskva trains are the development of OK cars, the principal changes in the design that the cars have undergone allow us to say that Moskva is an evolutionary new series. While developing the latest cars, the goal for the management of Moscow Metropolitan was set to approach the most advanced world models of subway trains. You can see in here that the driver's seat is equipped with so much different technologies that even the drivers that switched from the previous versions to Moskva trains had to train had to train once again to become keen on how the new system works. Can you imagine how far the progress have gone after the Yozh and the Namba trains? The width of door openings for faster boarding and landing of passengers was also increased. The so-called semi-sitting seats were introduced. These are actually inclined ledges on which one can lean. Also, the number of handrails was increased, which were covered with protective non-frozen plastic. Special seats for wheelchairs were also provided, and the total number of seats was reduced to increase the total capacity. The Moskva train series differs from all of its predecessors by particularly quiet and smooth running. Interactive schemes of metro lines, you can see them in here. They are touchscreen, so you can actually use them. You can circulate that. You can check the metro map if you're not sure where you are going. Also, USB sockets for charging of devices appeared in each car. The total capacity of trains was increased to take more than 2,000 people simultaneously, which is actually 2 times more than the first cars, the Type A cars. Can you imagine the difference in quantity of people that these trains are capable of having inside of them? Also, modern air conditioning and disinfection systems of course were used, as in Rusich and OK. Now, this is what the newest train that you can find in the underground of Moscow in 2020 looks like. But just for you to compare, I would like to tell you one interesting fact. On May 15th, 2010, on the day of the 75th anniversary of the Moscow Metro, there appeared a special retro train, which is stylized as A-type trains. The branded train consists actually of 7 cars of the number series, which were redesigned totally, completely redesigned, to look similar to the historical Top 8 trains that entered Sokolnitskaya line in 1935. The retro car is painted exactly like the first A-type cars. So we have a sandy yellow top in here and a light brown bottom. The train is also the only one in the Metropolitan of Moscow where Wi-Fi system was expressly not introduced. The interior of the whole train has been completely recreated to correspond the first train in the Moscow underground. So you can see the decorative facing is made with a textured surface of link rust in here, like the first material used in the first cars, which is well known to the passengers of the old generation. So while in the underground of Moscow today, you can actually compare the atmosphere of the newest technologies and the first electric cars that were launched 80 years ago. By the way, you can see the design inside of the car is actually pretty close to the one what we had with the A-type cars. I will show it to you again in here. So you can see it actually looks pretty the same. We have these sofas with very, very soft seats, and we have this lighting in here, which of course doesn't have open bulbs like in the first models, but it looks almost the same. So you can actually compare. You can see it in here. So this is the retro train that looks like the train of 1935, and this is the Moskva train. Just see the difference, the technological progress that the Moscow underground has seen over these 85 years. Now, I suppose that's it for today. That's all, folks, like in the cartoons. Goodbye. See you later. It was very, very nice chatting with you. Hope you liked the video.